this up. We're good. We're good. Okay. Well, thank you, Xiaoyan, for that very specific introduction, and thank you all for joining me here on a typically cloudy day. And for those of you who are, thank you as well for joining. It's really cool that you can do this and share this with someone virtually. As I said, my name is Geoffrey Van. I'm class of 14, and I want to tell you a story today. Well, really, it's my story, but it's one that is woven with the threads of many. And it's a story of how, and more importantly, why I found myself farming in a little central Washington town called Thorpe. See, I'm from Hong Kong originally, the land of concrete sterility, of food from plastic containers. And I was really, really a city boy through and through. So much so that I was afraid to touch my bare feet to the ground. This here is a picture of my mother, who I believe is tuning in, holding me at the beach, and I'm hysterically keeping my legs off the ground. And somehow she's managing to smile while she does this. So here's a shout out to moms and holding their crazy kids and smiling while they do it. But back to Hong Kong, I grew up where the cultural narratives were of progress and control and human might. And there was little conversation about our natural resources, let alone about what we put in our bodies. And I remember a guest speaker one day who was telling us about waste in Hong Kong, about where it goes, about landfills. And I remember very specifically the lie that changed me. Here's what it was. In 10 years, we will lose our harbor to landfill. Now, this is a spoiler. I'm sure many of you know we didn't, but at the time, it was a call to action. I became a recycling fanatic. It's, as a 10-year-old, what I thought that I could do to avoid this and to mitigate this. So I petitioned to have recycling bins put in the bottom of my apartment complex at home. I started rifling through the trash every night to cut the plastic windows out of envelopes so that I could recycle the paper and put the plastic in the trash. I mean, it's again, what as a 10-year-old's mind, it's what I thought I could do. And things took a really strange turn when I started collecting this stuff. And I don't mean the big ink eraser, but I mean the shavings that came off of the eraser. And I'll explain. I was in class and erasing something furiously, and it occurred to me that these shavings were still usable rubber. And I thought to myself, why don't we use this instead of shuffling onto the ground? We might as well, in this, again, recycling fanatic mindset, why don't we use this and make more erasers out of it, and we'll never need to be burning through our rubber reserves anymore, and we'll be able to create a closed cycle. And it took an even stranger turn when people started copying me. People would, at the end of their class days, they would collect their own eraser poo, and they would either give it to me to take home, or they would keep it for themselves, because this eraser poo craze became an economy of its own. People were trading at recess. And you have to understand that Asian stationery is pretty sophisticated. So we have many different colored erasers and erasers that produce different consistencies of eraser poo. But the point is, it was incredible. I mean, really, I started a movement, and sure, it was a useless movement, but it was a good lesson on human behavior. Especially now that I find myself in the midst of another craze, not unlike the eraser poo craze. So alas, I graduated to using pen, and that was the end of my eraser poo days. And I grew up a bit. And I found my way to Yale. And that's Brantford College, if any of you recognize it. Who was in Brantford? Yay, that's one. I graduated a cog-sci major. And from my cog-sci studies, I sort of held on to three sort of perennial ideas. The first is that humans are irrational. That is exemplified by eraser poo. I don't think much more needs to be said about that. The second is that to influence behavior, you have to start with motivations, people's motivations. And the third was that small actions can have large and often compounding effects. So right after college, I bought a one-way ticket to New Mexico and fell in love with farming. Originally, this was just a way to sustain myself on a small income, but I fell in love. It was really an accident that worked. I had one foot in the past and one foot in innovation, and both my hands in action. And it was so intuitive. It was so physically intuitive. It felt like I was learning a language. Speak to the computer more. All right. It felt like I was learning a language that I didn't know I already spoke. And I suspect that many of you would have this dormant, this sort of innate sixth sense in you as well. If you haven't touched your hands to the soil, I suggest that you do and see what happens. So this farming, farming here in New Mexico, it really satisfied my desire to be working with nature, with food, with animals, and in my body. I learned that nature is brilliant and that it wants to thrive. These walking onions on the right of the screen, they really blew me away. I had never considered that every natural process is a miracle of design and of sustainability. I was sold on agrarian living. Oh yeah, let's do that. Okay.
Yeah, I hate to see you. Is that balanced?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know what I did. Did I turn something on?
I think it's this guy.
Did I touch the switch? There it is. Sorry.
Is everything okay on the internet still? Xiaoyan, can you hear us?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah,
good.
We lost the projector for a second, but I think it's coming back here. Let's see. Hold on here. All right, we're getting back online here. But yeah, back to these walking onions. So it's really cool. What they do is they create their new bulbs on the top, and the picture will come back in a moment for those of us in the room, and we'll see what I'm talking about. But they create new bulbs on the top of their onion greens, and they become top heavy, and so they drop down, dropping the new bulbs into the soil, and that's how they create more onions. So yeah, these walking onions, exactly, cool, exactly. They blew me away. I had never considered.
Just continue to talk.
Yeah. I never considered that. Yeah, every natural process is a miracle of design and sustainability, and I began to understand that farming could be an answer to climate change. But it was incomplete. This homestead scale wasn't an active solution to climate change. It was just my isolation from it, which led me to whole animal butchery. I was living in New York City and working for a great company called Fleischer's. They have whole animal butcher shops in New York and Connecticut, and they really are kind of the forerunners of training the next generation of whole animal butchers of pasture-raised meats specifically. And at this point, I was convinced from my studies that climate change and food security are super important, and that pasture-raised animals are part of the solution. Now, this company was doing really hands-on work to change the way that people think about and eat meat, and I was really blessed to be a part of it. But I missed the land. I realized that to be most effective and to flourish, I belonged on that land, which led me back to.
That's fine. That's good.
Which led me to Deck Family Farm. Should I pause here?
No. This is just continue talking.
Okay, I'm gonna continue talking. We're having more.
Just be more
projector.
descriptive.
Projector
Like,
issues. Here are pictures of animals. There are. Let me paint a picture for you. There's. We can circle back to that. I found my way to Deck Family Farm and picture the perfect, like, Beethoven's fifth pastoral landscape, and picture cows on there. Was it his fifth or his sixth? Sixth. Beethoven's sixth. Pardon me. Pastoral landscape and cows eating rich, luscious grass. That's where I was at Deck Family Farm in Junction City, Oregon, where we raise multi-species livestock on pasture. And there I began planning Spoonful Farm, which is where we are now, located in Thorpe, Washington. And for those of you online, you might see where the little red pointer is, that little bend in the river. Nearly 1 year ago exactly, 4 friends and I moved out there to grow our food. Now,
I know.
this farm was originally a conventional tilling and spraying hay farm, the detriments of which I will shortly explain. Now, everyone in the valley, in the Kittitas Valley, everyone grows grass for haying. Much of it is a grass called Timothy grass, and 90% of this Timothy grass is shipped to Japan. That is literally shipping away our organic matter. And since taking over last year, we began converting this land to the living embodiment of loyal to soil, practicing whole earth farming. So I'm a soil farmer, and you'll soon see what that means. But first, just want to pose a question to the audience here. What are some of the biggest problems facing the world? And feel free to shout out your answer if anything at all. Water. War. Pardon me? Loss of topsoil. Warming. Yes, there are a lot of great answers here. Oh, there we go. Our pictures are back. Almost. So these are all awesome answers, and actually, this is super convenient. I was unsure how this was gonna. Yay, our pictures are back on in the room. Our pictures are back on the projector. All of the answers that people tossed out, they really can boil down to one factor, which is soil. And so yeah, soil. Where do we begin when we talk about soil? The first thing to know is that soil is alive. There are more organisms in this handful than there are people on Earth. The way I like to think about it is that the planet is a living organism, and soil makes up its skin. So think about how we treat our own skin. Are we gouging and inverting and treating our epidermis with deadly chemicals? Probably not. So why would we treat the Earth's skin like that? Especially when 90% of our food comes from this soil. Soil is still the most cost-effective and multi-beneficial way to grow food. And on an ecological level, soil is super important for landscapes, for nutrient cycling, for water retention and filtration, for moisture stress, whether that's too little water or too much water. Super important for biodiversity and wildlife habitats, for storing and transforming compounds, and for the physical support and stability that it gives. There we go. All right. The images on the computer again are being strange. We're going to keep going. For the physical stability and support, most of what we know as soil is happening beneath the surface. Carrot roots, for example, can reach 7 feet down underground. And so the question is, what facilitates all of this? The answer is microbes. So these microbes are the engines of communication between plants. They break down the organic matter, and you can see that right here, from the plants and from the waste and the residue. Microbes. They break that down, and they facilitate the nutrient transfers by making them available to each other species in the food web. So one thing that sort of blew my mind about this is that roots of plants, they actually don't have mouths, but microbes do. And really, the microbes are feeding the soil minerals and the nutrients to the plants, and we eat those plants. And what do microbes eat? Well, they eat the decaying organic matter to stay alive, which is mostly made up of carbon. Healthy soil depends on these healthy microbes, and healthy microbes eat the carbon that the plants pump down into the soil through their roots. We all remember the processes of photosynthesis, right? In general, plants inhale carbon dioxide and exhale oxygen. Carbon, the C of the molecule, makes up most of the plant and is stored in the ground as organic matter. Naturally, soil is a massive, massive carbon sink. There's actually more carbon in the soil than found in plants, animals, and the atmosphere combined, which means that there's huge potential here for both loss and accumulation of carbon. And what does this mean for climate change? Well, the world's cultivated soils have already lost over 50% of their original carbon stock. When we till and when we erode our soils, we not only lose the stored carbon, but we lose that carbon storing potential as well. And what does this mean for the food I eat? Well, several things. Healthier soils produce food that is more delicious, more nutritious. Sick soils produce sickly food. This soil destruction creates a positive feedback loop in which more carbon is released, less carbon is stored, which further heats the planet, which further hastens the progress of climate change. And back to food. Remember that eraser poo? The way something, of course you do. The way that something viewed as a waste was turned into a form of currency that kids were trading during recess. Well, soil, this is the new poo. Healthy soil ought to be valued as we value other precious natural resources. This stuff is worth our good health. This stuff is worth delicious food. This stuff is worth the planet we call home, and it's worth our future. So to understand how Spoonful Farm is farming, I think it makes sense to talk about how modern farming practices are disrupting healthy soils. And really the main culprit in this is tilling. There are many contributors to soil degradation, but the one I want to focus on, because it is so pervasive and so destructive, is tilling. Now, tilling works in a short run to superficially prepare lands between crop plantings, but soil microbes were quickly killed in the process. So, synthetic fertilizers came to the rescue to artificially provide the now dead soil with the nutrients it needed to keep growing plants. Meanwhile, without the physical sturdiness of healthy plants and soils working together, our soils eroded. Now, this is a really cool story. On the left, you see a farmer holding a strand of very impressive Kernza wheat next to, directly above him, conventional wheat. Now, Kernza is a perennial wheat, meaning it doesn't need to be tilled and replanted every year. So over time, it can sequester tons and tons of carbon, literally, without oxidizing any of it, developing root systems, as you can see here, up to 10 feet long. These root systems, the microbe habitats. Hopworks Urban Brewery, that some of you might know, they're located actually here in Portland. They teamed up with Patagonia Provisions to brew this regenerative beer. It's super, super cool. And no, it's not super cool, soil erosion. Look at that conventional wheat. You see that nothing is holding it together, whereas on the Kernza side, the soil has this web of these fingers reaching down and holding everything in place. And soil erosion is a huge contributor to the loss of organic matter, to carbon oxidation, and to ecological destruction. I'm sure we all remember learning about the Dust Bowl, which resulted from mechanized deep plowing, turning the Great Plains into clouds of unsecured topsoil. The Dust Bowl was a period of huge ecological degradation, massive economic depression, and this kind of desertification is happening on a huge scale, and on a scale that matters, considering that 20 to 40% of the Earth's land surfaces are grasslands. When we talk about destroying these grasslands, we're talking about a lot of carbon, both in loss storing potential and in oxidation. In fact, 1.7 billion tons of farmland around the world are lost every year to erosion. That might not be a number that you can fathom, so that's the equivalent of 30 soccer fields every minute. Or in our country, just our country, picture this, we're running a 116-mile-long freight train loaded with soil straight into the ocean every single day. That's about the distance from the map here from Washington, D.C. to Philadelphia. Every day, a freight train loaded with soil running into the ocean from erosion. And where did that soil go? Well, yeah, into the ocean. And what happens there? The elemental balances of our rivers and our oceans are being totally thrown off by the excesses of nitrogen and other elements, and our oceans are dying. All of the runoff creates these massive algae blooms that release toxins and asphyxiate the surrounding ocean. These areas are called dead zones because everything dies in these places. In fact, this is a fun and scary fact. This is exactly what happened in the largest mass extinction of animal and plant life in Earth's history. It was during the Permian-Triassic transition 252 million years ago. It is also the only known mass extinction of insects, so it wasn't all bad. No, I'm just kidding. But it was deadly, and it's known today as the Great Dying, and it all stemmed from erosion. And the soil that doesn't run away, that's dying too. And as it does, it releases greenhouse gases such as nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide that have been safely stored away underground, where they belong. We are quick to dispose of soil, forgetting that soil is finite and slow to recover. It takes 1,000 years to naturally generate about an inch of new soil. If we continue plowing through our soil reserves at our current rate, the world's topsoil could be gone within 60 years. That's within my lifetime. That's certainly within the lifetime of my children to be. But of course, people have been catching on. Labels for organics and non-GMO, for example, are now widespread, which is a really, really good thing. But it's it's incomplete. There are still shortcomings to these labels. And to demonstrate that, I would like to read an excerpt from our blog written by one of our fellow students, Marcos. Imagine a flat field stretching off to the horizon in every direction. Bare dirt, light brown, dusty, with a slight ammonia reek. There's an enormous tractor strafing back and forth over the land, puffing diesel fumes, spraying a chemical called copper sulfate, designed to kill the unwanted fungi. A few months later, grain will be harvested from this field and then trucked or shipped to a granary, and then trucked or shipped again to a confined animal feeding operation, and then poured into a long tube that terminates in buckets and pens that are 1 foot long and 1 foot wide. That's about twice the size of your head. In that cage sits a white feathered chicken who has been there for most of her life, hardly able to move, even if her legs could support the oversized bulk of her breast. She's never ever turned around. She just eats. Then, that chicken's breast, her unused wings, and her drumsticks are cut up and packaged by undocumented immigrants recruited and brought in from Nicaragua. Workers who cut for hours and hours and hours in a row, who are often denied bathroom breaks, who are out of luck, they get injured on the job. Now picture those pieces of chicken, shrink wrapped and stacked on a shelf in the grocery store, labeled organic, $7 a pound. The fact is that this organic label, while a step from conventional, big step from conventional, is still misleading and allows for some seriously shady practices. For example, the use of poisons, such as rotenone. Now, rotenone is derived from natural sources, such as the jicama vine, but it's sprayed in high and dangerous concentrations to kill insects, many of them beneficial pollinators. These concentrations have been found to be dangerous for humans. Injecting rotenone in rats causes symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Deliberate ingestion of rotenone can be fatal. And then you get to monocultures, like what you see here. A monoculture is growing only one type of crop. Now, healthy soil systems require a delicate balance of pH levels, minerals, and biological controls. Nature's solution to this is to have complementary plants surrounding one another, feeding the soil what it needs. In the wilderness, one never sees just one type of plant growing. So what happens in a monoculture? Well, insect, pest species are imbalanced above and below the soil. Above, one species becomes too dominant on one host plant, as opposed to a variety of host plants that promote species diversity that check and balance each other. And below, the roots are often not deep enough, nor diverse enough, and the biome is disrupted. Remember that food web? There's an order of eating operations. Everybody needs everybody to flourish. Furthermore, there's no elemental fixation with monocultures. The diversity of plants bring a diversity of elements and nutrients into the soil. People might know, if people have tried their hands at farming or at just general gardening, that legumes, for example, are famous for pulling nitrogen and putting it down into the soil. When you only plant one crop, you only get one nutrient fixing. And finally, the lack of ground cover. This type of monoculturing causes more erosion, which we remember means less water retention and more greenhouse gases oxidized. So how can monocultures grow in these conditions? Well, they can't, not unless they use synthetic fertilizers, poisons like the one above, to deal with the intensified weed and pest outbreaks. And then there's tillage, which we discussed is the #1 emitter of carbon in the agriculture industry. It drains the health of our food, and by the transitive property, it drains our health. Tillage kills the life that feeds the life that feeds us. And then we get to animal welfare. There's that chicken story. Pretty gruesome. And it's the same thing with pigs, confined animal feeding operations. And with beef, it's perhaps even worse. Cows are built to eat grass, but we've got them on corn. Corn that's nearly, without exception, grown in tilled monocultures, which is a double whammy there. So now you have a cow that doesn't walk around much because there's nowhere to go. Furthermore, they eat corn, which fattens them up quickly, but makes them sick because their rumens malfunction. So what do we do about overfed and sick animals? We give them antibiotics, of course. These high-energy feedlots, they definitely increase production, but it also increases the psychological stresses experienced by the animals, which have been proven to increase the occurrence of infectious diseases. What do we do about that? Again, antibiotics. Not to mention that we're missing out on a huge opportunity to use these wonderful animals how they were designed, to work with nature, to build soil, to be nutrient-rich and delicious. The organic label is a good benchmark in some ways, but it won't heal the planet. and it won't heal you. Now, all of this might sound scary, and I don't mean to scare everyone because there's great news. And the great news is that there's a better way, and it's fun, and it's beautiful, and it's delicious. We at Spoonful Farm strive to be the providers of one such example. At Spoonful Farm, we really view ourselves as soil farmers. The livestock, the grasslands, the vegetables and hedgerows and trees and bees that we raise, they are all a means to this end. We practice whole earth farming, and we are loyal to soil. Here's what that means. We don't till anywhere. Beyond that, we disturb the soil as little as possible. We dig our beds, and then we never step on them to compact them. Do everything we can to protect that precious, delicate soil habitat. We harvest a plant, and then we leave the roots in place to feed the life underground. We plant a different plant species on top. We also use cover crops to reduce erosion and to add fertility and biodiversity to the soil. Here we have in our greenhouse daikon and fava bean, which when we're done, we just let them decompose in place and we can plant right on top of that. The carbon that we put in the ground, in other words, it stays in the ground. After one season, the changes were really surprisingly apparent. When we got to Thorpe, the soil was sandy and dry and dead. And after just one season, it was loose but structured, and it was a deep black, and it smelled alive. And actually, when we looked closer, we saw that there was actual life in it, nematodes and arthropods and fungi. And most importantly, the food tasted like this newfound vitality, which is to say that it was delicious. And what about animals? Well, we practice something called management-intensive rotational grazing. First of all, we don't till. We want all those microbes to thrive. And then with temporary fences and daily rotations, we mimic the natural herd movements of ruminants, the ruminants that created the Great Plains of our planets, roaming around in a quest for food, water, and safety from predators. Here you can see a before and after of our wonderful British white park cattle on pasture. On the right of the line, you can see where they once were, and on the left, you can see where they are grazing on some fresh forage. And what we do is we force them to eat a plot all the way down. Not all the way down, as far as they're comfortable doing so without overworking the land, and then we move them. Ruminant digestion is the most efficient way to turn plants into potent fertilizing manure, creating an abundance of soil organic matter, and over time, taller, stronger, and healthier grasses. The picture here might be a little unclear, but this is Marco's spoon, marveling at the magic product of rumination. He has a nice cow patty in his right hand, and he's grinning happily at the magic of these wonderful animals. Now, this is not just sustainability. This is regeneration. This is rebuilding lost organic matter. This is pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it safely away. And we do this with multiple species. The cows first, they aerate the topsoil with their hooves, and they efficiently deposit these massive bioavailable fertilizing patties. Then the goats and the sheep eat weeds and brush, and they eat lower to the ground. We move our sheep herd the same way that we move the cattle, except that our sheep have a guardian. This is Finn, our guardian llama. And if you thought Finn was great, here are some very recent and obligatory photos of our lambs and kids from actually just the past week. I threw them in here last minute. And this little goat kid is just a couple hours old. And you can see her sister actually in the background looking for her mama's milk. And this is her mom, Lingerie, named by the previous owner, chomping on some overgrown pasture. And on the right, you can see a week-old chick. A lot of baby photos, which might be cheating, but that's okay. And these chickens are super important as well. These chickens eat insects and other parasitic pests while spreading the manure, those big fertilizing cow patties, not to mention their own nitrogen-rich droppings. We give them fresh daily pasture and protection from predation. And that's what we're doing here. We're moving them to give them a fresh plot every day. And the more we do this, the healthier and more productive our pastures become. And as our pastures improve, so does the nutrition and deliciousness of our food. And as our pastures improve, we also increase our capacity to store carbon. It's a positive feedback loop. Finally, we are committed to supporting our own economic viability. We believe that our economic viability is crucial
for our ecological viability. Insofar as we can only do this if our business works. And furthermore, we want others to do this. And it's important to appeal to what people are motivated by, as we learned in cognitive science. People are motivated by money. We are only one farm, but if we can show that we can farm like this, then we might be able to convince others to do it as well, to convert soil-degraded lands into calorie, nutrition, and joy-rich foods. We can make a huge difference. Another active principle of the farm is education and outreach. We have our first 2 interns arriving this season. One actually just arrived, and we plan to teach them all that we know so that they can take these skills and apply them elsewhere. And though we've only been around a year, we've given talks and tours to youth groups, to local public elementary schools, and savvy sitter-goers as well. And we have many more planned, just like this one, to all you kind Christmas folks here. One highlight of this past season was our harvest dinner with Chef Tarek. Chef Tarek is a Seattle native, there he is on the left, who's been committed to teaching children of color about where food comes from, how to cook, and how to eat well. He's committed to spreading the joys of good ingredients and good health. And so you might be wondering, does this actually work, and what do I get out of it? So it's helping the planet, but what is my personal gain? And to address that, I'm going to take a short Wendell Berry intermission, a little quote from the great author. While we live, our bodies are moving particles of earth, joined inextricably both to the soil and to the bodies of other living creatures. It is hardly surprising then that there should be some profound resemblances between our treatment of our bodies and our treatment of the earth. Whole earth farmed food is healthier. You've probably heard that grass-fed animals are better for you, but also that red meat should be avoided. There's a lot of health confusion out there, and here are a couple things that we found for sure. Consider Argentinians, who eat nearly double the amount of beef that Americans eat in a year, 80 to 150 pounds per person. Until relatively recently, they ate nearly exclusively grass-fed beef. In Argentinian men, compared to American men, there was 30% less coronary heart disease, despite twice the rate of smoking and more than half the population not having access to adequate healthcare. So sure, Argentinians aren't healthy, but it's clear that their beef isn't killing them either. And that's probably because grass-fed beef contains more vitamin E, B, and beta-carotene than corn-fed beef. Vitamin E and beta-carotene are antioxidants, which help fight heart disease, Parkinson's, cancer, diabetes, and Alzheimer's, to name a few. And then we talk about the fat, and this is where the really big differences occur. With regard to saturated fats, beef contains 3 types: mystearic acid, palmitic acid, and stearic acid. The first 2 raise LDL, that famous bad cholesterol, whereas stearic acid breaks down to become monounsaturated, of which there's a lot in olive oil, for example. So grass-fed beef has less saturated fat overall, and of the saturated fat that it does have, there's less of the LDL stuff and more of the stearic acid. And then we get into the unsaturated fats. This is where things actually really take off and get really cool. You've probably heard of omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. They're both super important for good health. The key, though, is in their ratio. Ideally, 4 to 1, 4 omega-6 to 1 omega-3. Most Americans, their consumption ratio is about 15 to 1. Corn oil, for example, is at about 46 to 1. Corn-fed beef is about 20 to 1. And grass-fed beef is typically at 3 to 1, nearly at that 4 to 1 ratio, but as low as 1 to 1. Furthermore, grass-fed beef contains twice as much of CLA, conjugated linoleic acid, which is a newly famous fatty acid that has been found to, in labs, inhibit the growth of tumors, for example. And then we get into the nutrient content of the vegetables. Do you remember the healthy microbes in the soil that make the minerals and those nutrients bioavailable for the plants to eat? We, in turn, eat those plants. For example, soil fungi produce an antioxidant amino acid called ergothioneine, the concentration of which researchers at Penn State have found to be directly correlated with the frequency of tilling. More tilling means less of the antioxidant-producing fungi, which, remember, is crucial for feeding our food its food. Furthermore, a 2003 study published in the Journal of Nutrition and Health looked at mineral depletion in an average of 27 vegetable varieties from 1940 to 1991. And they found that copper had decreased 76%, calcium was down 46%, iron down 27%, magnesium down 24%, and potassium down 16%, just to name a few. So what happened to all of these nutritive minerals? Well, two things. One is erosion. As discussed, we just simply sent a lot of it down into our rivers, into our oceans. But the bigger problem was the absence of microbes, lost from tilling. Remember that these microbes, they feed our plants, and those plants feed us. Finally, there's ongoing research at UMass, Johns Hopkins, and UC Davis on soil health, food nutrition, and obesity. Essentially, they found that we are getting less nutritive value out of the same volume of food. So our gut microbiomes are malnourished, and they tell our brain to eat more so that they can get more of those essential nutrients. And so we eat more than we're designed for the same amount of nutritive value. Whole earth farmed food is healthier for the whole you. And what about climate change? How much carbon can we actually store? Well, it's hard to say, but it's the focus of a lot of current study. Actually, a study published in the November issue of Scientific Reports found that through better soil management practices, the carbon stored in the top 30 centimeters or foot of soil could increase 0.9 to 1.85 gigatons every year. For scale, the global transportation sector produces 1.87 gigatons every year. So that's offsetting the entire transportation industry of the world. We have to remember that 50 to 70% of our soil carbon has already been oxidized since the Industrial Revolution. And most of the world's carbon is stored in cool, wet, northern hemisphere areas, with the US actually holding the most potential overall to sequester carbon. Places like here in Portland, places like Thorpe. And then what about methane and other animal emissions? Well, a 2006 study published in the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation found that with the right regenerative crop and grazing management, ruminants not only reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions, but also serve the ecosystem, increase soil carbon sequestration, and reduce environmental damage. Erosion, again, tips the scale here. Remember that 116-mile-long freight train loaded with soil running into the ocean every day. We can stop that train in its tracks. And back to the animal emissions. Compare for yourself. Which would have a greater carbon footprint? Tilled, soil-degrading corn fed to beef, or cattle rotated on grass and cover crops, building healthy soil, that great carbon sponge? Not to mention the repaired wildlife habitats and increased biodiversity in grazing ruminants. There's a lot of exciting pending research on also these other little guys called methanotrophs. They are organisms that metabolize methane actually as their only source of carbon and energy. And these methanotrophs, they live in healthy, untilled soils where all of our microorganisms, as we talked about, can thrive. And finally, the strategic use of shade and mulch and cover cropping can really mitigate the soil organic carbon loss by keeping the nutrients from immediately oxidizing and from not tilling, keeping them in place. We want to provide an alternative for meat eaters. It's true that cutting back on the consumption of conventionally raised meat could really reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But the truth is that meat eaters eat meat. Which part of the equation is easier to change? The fact that they're meat eaters, invoking a total lifestyle, cultural, tradition, diet shift, or the meat that they eat, conventional to pasture raised? And furthermore, I mean, it's delicious. And I'm gonna do a little time travel here to talk about the future. I know in the event description, I made a perhaps bold claim that the agriculture industry could become the next tech industry. And I'm gonna take a moment here to address that. I think that whole earth farming is in a really, really cool place right now. And we really see it as an analog for the tech industry in its early days. In the tech industry, you have these technologies and innovations that are providing a previously unavailable service. Similarly, in the world of whole earth farming, we have this emerging body of research in the field of carbon sequestration and soil beneficial practices to produce delicious and nutrient-dense food. And it's being adopted, although in pockets, in different applications. And I'm gonna talk for a quick moment about some of those, also as a chance to celebrate some of our teachers. One example is for grains. The guy on the far left, Gabe Brown, found that rotating commodity grains, the staple grains that make up the bulk of the American diet, rotating these grains with animals and intense cover cropping can accumulate an incredible amount of organic matter in a very, very short amount of time. And then you have guys like Jean-Martin Fortier in the middle, who have developed systems, economic and ecological, for no-till veggie farms. Found that on really small acreage, you can have really high yields, high profits, and because you're so small, you can really be close to market to be hyper-local and convenient for your consumers. And you don't need a lot of land to do it. So these little market gardens are popping up all over the place. And then finally, with pasture-raised animals, you have guys like Joel Salatin on the far right, who has sort of brought this management-intensive grazing to the mainstream, going beyond just the model for grass-fed, but actually having animals on the ground, grazing in systems that mimic the early days of animals on plains. Now, these practices together make up the American diet. You have your grains and your vegetables and your meats, but they're far from ubiquitous, and there's therefore huge, huge growth potential. And then getting even a little more far-fetched, automation, which is talked a lot about these days as well, which the industry oracles predict to be inevitable. Naturally, many people will be seeking jobs and meaningful ways to spend their time. At the same time, farming, as we're talking about now, needs to move away from the industrialized, automated systems. So agriculture needs more people on the ground practicing whole earth farming, while we're going to get a massive influx of people looking for meaningful ways to spend their time. It seems like a good fit. And also, automation will apply to farming. It can assist in large-scale whole earth operations. More importantly, it will level the playing field. Imagine that management-intensive cattle system I described, where we have the cattle moving from plot to plot. And imagine it on really huge, huge acreage, storing carbon and building soil. It would be hard to manage, but if we had automatic fences and if our pastures were, and our cattle were monitored by drones and robots, we could really make beef cheaper to raise on grass than on corn. This is an actual picture of an actual robot. Scientists in Australia are pioneering ways to do just that, to begin to use robotics to help monitor their massive herds, to lower the costs of raising grass-fed beef in a regenerative way. So, why should we be loyal to soil? To save the planet, to sequester carbon, for the healthy food too. The food that is nutrient dense and not sprayed with poisons. We're loyal to soil for the humanely raised and soil-building livestock. Unlike a lot of farms as well, you can visit us, you can talk to us, and you can ask us questions. We think that's pretty special. And all you have to do is to eat delicious food. And so how can you be loyal to soil? Well, you can join our email list, which I have here for those of us who are here in person, or find us and sign up for our email list on our website. You can read our blog. Maricos writes a lot of wonderful and diverse stuff about what we do here, or what we do in Thorpe, rather. And that little excerpt I read, that grisly picture about the chickens, there are many more wonderful, wonderful stories just like that. And you can follow us on social media, on Instagram and on Facebook. And if you're here in person, you can buy some t-shirts and eggs that I brought. We don't have any vegetables at this time of year. And if you're Seattle-based, or if you know someone in Seattle, you can really do yourself a favor, love yourself, and gather a season's harvest in our weekly Whole Earth CSA box, which we just started subscriptions for. Or better yet, what better gift than the gift of good health? Give a Seattle loved one the gift of good health for 12 to 24 weeks, depending on how much vegetable they would want to enjoy over the course of the summer. Now, we sell locally, which means that for many of you, we're pretty far for regular patronage. But Deck Family Farm, like the one I talked about working at, and many, many others come to Portland every weekend. In fact, there are great farms all over the place. So no matter where you are online, or all of you here, wherever you're here visiting from, I implore you to check out your local farmers market and ask your farmers how they raise their food. And one final thought. In his whirlwind book about steak called plainly Steak, the writer Mark Schatzker writes that deliciousness is more fundamental than eloquence. That's just it. Our sense of taste came from an instinct for survival. Ripe food tastes sweet, and sweet foods give us energy, and energy means that life goes on. In terms of evolutionary development, we developed a sense of taste millions of years before we had language. So, on that note, enough of my words on polar farming and soil regeneration. I invite you to taste it. On my honor, you will understand, you will embody what it means to be the soil. Thank you. Question? Yeah, go for it. Uh-huh. Totally. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Geoffrey, could you repeat the question?
I will.
No.
Well, I'll start by talking to you after this, if I may. For those of you online, the perhaps more of a comment than a question was simply noting the similarities, in fact, like the linguistic overlap of the microbiomes in the soil and our gut microbiomes, essentially, and suggesting that we begin essentially testing for what exact microbes are living in our soils, and perhaps even tracking how their populations can flourish over time. Totally, yeah. That's one of the cool things really about being in sort of this startup-y landscape is there aren't a lot of resources out there that are dedicated to understanding and helping us to keep track of what we're doing. And so we find that we're borrowing from a lot of other disciplines all the time. Yeah, super exciting time. Thank you. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the question for those of us, for everybody online, is how can we? Let me turn this. Get our faces back here. Maybe that's better. So the question was, how can we expect to feed the world population?
No, the U.S. population.
Just the U.S. population. 300 million people, 3 meals a day. I understand. Yeah. So with our methods, how can we feed the American population? We'll just go with.
It's a good question, and it is highly debated. I mean, it's acre for acre, growing food and growing food domestically. We do believe that we will be able to. I mean, on like really a 1 acre plot, you can support a community of support a community for the.
I don't know.
With animals, it gets a little trickier, and again, like the key there is moving away from the terrible conversion, like feed conversion ratios of feeding one feed, like the amount of foreign energy that it takes to raise like a full-grown cow. It's efficient for sure, but it is. I mean, it's a waste of acreage. Not only a waste of acreage, but it's really making. I mean, it's making the planet sick. So we have to move away from that. I think that those last 3 people that I mentioned are. I mean, there are many people who are looking at it, and a lot of people do suggest that vegetarian will feed everybody and also heal the planet. But we have found, especially with that Gabe Brown, for example, the guy on the far left, he rotates with his cover cropping and his staple grains, which are crucial for calorie rich and dense food for the Americans. He also, animals are a huge part of that.
Need better speak.
And it also gets back to the point that, I mean, it's effectively, the way we see it is that it's effectively will be impossible to convince people to stop eating. And so we want instead to adapt to that and provide an alternative that doesn't. It didn't fully answer your question, I know, and it's something that, I mean, truth is like we don't know. I mean, it's hard for anybody to predict what's going to happen in whether that's month or next 5 years. But we have to try. And again, like leveraging our economic viability, using that as a motivator for other people to take the time. It's really it would only happen if we had a coach converting lands to this. Yeah, totally. Yeah, and we're seeing people do this. I mean, a lot of farmers now are turning on to no-till out of necessity because their soils are not able to store water anymore. So they actually aren't doing it for the ecological benefits, but because it's the only way that they can grow their commodity grain. So we have these no-till drills that just drill the seeds down into the ground without sowing the soil first, which is great for us. I mean, even if they're doing it for the wrong reasons. The point is that the land, after being tilled and degraded for so long, is like it's simply unable to produce food the way that we have. Yes. Yes. Should we?
Geoffrey, could you look at this from Sierran's comment?
Yeah. So which questions do we want to
So
ask?
towards the end, did you have influence from Yale professor James Scott?
I didn't. I'm actually not familiar with James Scott's work. 2 Cheers for Anarchism. I mean, that sounds right up our alley. We'll definitely have to check that one out. And he's a Yale as well, so that's great. No, thank you for pointing that out. We'll definitely add that to our library. We're building a good collection of regenerative agriculture books back at the farm. And this would certainly have a place.
Great, thank you, Geoffrey. Feel free to spend more time with people on site. And I want to just wrap this up for everybody else and thank everybody else online. And I wanted your mom to say hi to you, but she's probably in her pajamas.
I don't. It's okay. I told her that this is going to be recorded, and I think she might have gotten that memo.
Yeah, we have people. We have Renata. Is Renata from in London right now? We have Ciaran from Ireland, and Jane from New York. So thank you, Ben from DC. So thank you, everybody. If you have any other questions, feel free to go to Geoffrey's website and email him or connect with him. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Xiaoyan. It's Caroline here in Hong Kong.
Oh,
I am in my PJs because it is something like 5 in the morning now. But thank you so much for hosting Geoffrey, and thank you and the Yale Club for hosting Geoffrey today. And I learned a lot, even in the middle of the night. I'll have to watch this again when I wake up from the stream.
All right. Thank you, everyone in the room. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.